Hey everyone, welcome to Sidetrack Adventures. This is Steve. Right now we're in Greenville, Ohio, and near here is where Phoebe Ann Mosey was born. Despite being born near here and growing up here in Western Ohio, far from the American West, through her association with Buffalo Bill, she would become one of the most famous figures of the Wild West and in the country, under the name Annie Oakley. We are currently in far western Ohio, near the Indiana state line, about 40 miles northwest of Dayton. I was going to start out today by looking around Annie Oakley Park here, but I just realized that Annie Oakley's birthplace is only about 20 miles from here, so we're going to head there real quick. Then we'll head back here and look around before heading to her gravesite, which is also outside of town. Even today, the area where Annie Oakley was born is pretty rural. And this is it. Annie was born in a log cabin near this spot on August 13th, 1860, the sixth of 9 children. Her father was 61 when she was born and died 5 years later, leaving their family in poverty. She had a pretty terrible childhood overall. At age 9, she was put under the care of the Darke County Infirmary, which was basically the poorhouse. And then in 1870, she was sent to work with a couple to help care for their infant son. The job was basically slavery, and she endured physical and mental abuse from them for 2 years. Even in her autobiography, she wouldn't mention their names, only calling them the Wolves. By this time, Annie had already been trapping and hunting for years, and began to make money hunting local game and selling it to shops in Greenville. I don't think there's much else out here to see though, so let's head back to Greenville. In her childhood, this area would have been a lot more wooded than it is now, but it probably looks much like it did later in her life. This is probably more what the area would have looked like when she was a kid. Annie Oakley is definitely a big deal in these parts, even nearly a century after she died. Just check out this barn. We've made it back to the park. It's a Sunday, so there's hardly anyone walking around downtown right now besides us. It's said that in 1875, Annie entered a shooting contest against a traveling marksman named Frank Butler. At first, Butler didn't know who he'd be facing off against, only that $100 was on the line. He was pretty surprised when he found out that his opponent was a small, 15-year-old girl. Butler lost, but ended up falling in love with Annie. The two would get married and spend 50 years together. I should note there is some dispute as to the date of the shooting contest, with some recent historical research stating that it may have happened as late as 1881, making her 21 at the time, not 15. Sometime after her and Frank's meeting, she began going by the name Annie Oakley, most likely taking Oakley from the name of a Cincinnati neighborhood. By the mid-1880s, Annie joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And just as a background for anyone who isn't familiar with it, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was one of the most influential entertainment spectacles of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The show helped define what the Wild West was to most people. While the real frontier was messy, diverse, and often brutal, Buffalo Bill's show turned it into a clear-cut story of cowboys versus Indians, heroic scouts, and rugged pioneers. That mythic version still influences movies, TV shows, books, and even how history is taught today. Annie would go on to become one of the most highly paid entertainers on the show, second only to Buffalo Bill himself. It looks like Greenville is also the hometown of the commander of America's first rigid airship, which I think most people would just call a Zeppelin. Here's an illustration of how Greenville looked in the early 1900s. It's pretty cool because a lot of the same buildings are still here. No light rail though, unfortunately. Before we head out to Annie Oakley's final resting place, let's take a quick look around town. There's an Annie Oakley mural on this building. When I picture the classic American small-town Main Street, it looks pretty much like this. Unfortunately, because we're here on a Sunday, most of the stores are closed, but it's neat to see that most of them are at least occupied. Another person who toured with Buffalo Bill was Sitting Bull, the Lakota chief who defeated General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Even though he was technically a prisoner of the United States, he was allowed to tour with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He and Annie became friends, and he nicknamed her Watanya Sisela, which was translated to Little Sure Shot. I can't overstate what a draw Annie was, partly because of the novelty of seeing a woman being so proficient with a rifle at the time, but also because of her small stature. She was just 5 feet tall, but with a rifle in her hand, she was unstoppable. She had a trick where she would shoot the ashes off a cigarette from her husband's lips, which I'm sure Frank Butler was very careful not to start any arguments with her before the show. She could also hit a dime tossed in midair. Crowds couldn't believe their eyes. Check out the Darke County Courthouse here. This was built in 1874, and the building to the left was the sheriff's house and jail, and that was built in 1870. Annie Oakley became famous worldwide. She did several tours of Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and even performed at Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee for the royal family, including the future King Edward VII. There's also a story where Kaiser Wilhelm II saw her do the trick where she shot the cigarette out of Frank Butler's mouth and wanted her to repeat the trick while he held the cigarette. Later on, she would say that if she only messed that trick up and shot him, she would have maybe saved millions of lives and prevented World War I. Apparently, after World War I broke out, she even wrote the Kaiser a letter saying that she wanted to repeat the shot. He never replied. The Treaty of Greenville was signed near here in 1795, in which a number of Native American tribes gave up most of their lands in what is now Ohio. There are so many cool old buildings to look at here. I wish I was here on a weekday so I could go inside a few of them. Now that the sun is coming out a bit more, let's head a few miles out of town and visit Annie Oakley's final resting place. It looks like they're nice enough to put a sign to show us where to go. At pretty much the height of her fame, Annie sustained severe injuries in a 1901 train accident, leading to temporary paralysis and requiring 5 spinal operations for her recovery. Following this, she departed from the Buffalo Bill show. In 1902, she embarked on a less demanding acting career, starring in The Western Girl, a stage play specifically written for her. And we have another sign. There's no hunting around this place to find what we're looking for. We have a historic marker here too. And here they are, the graves of Annie Oakley and her husband Frank Butler. And you'll notice they both have the same year of death. Annie would continue to perform and set shooting records for almost the rest of her life. Her health started to decline in 1925, and she passed away at the age of 66 on November 3rd, 1926. And it looks like some rounds have been left for her, just in case of a comeback. Frank Butler was so distraught over her death, he stopped eating and died 18 days later. Annie was cremated, and Butler was buried, and a joint funeral was held on Thanksgiving Day in 1926. Here's the historic marker next to the grave. This lists 1882 as the date of their wedding, not the earlier 1870s date. Annie did have a rivalry with a younger shooter, and so she would tell people she was younger than she was, so as not to be upstaged by the other girl. That may have helped lead to the confusion of when she met and married Frank Butler. If you're wondering about the grave in between Annie and Frank's tombstones, that's the grave for two of Annie Oakley's nephews. Annie Oakley may not have ridden with outlaws or settled dusty frontier towns, but a century later, she's still one of the most iconic figures of the American West. That says a lot about the power of myth and her incredible talent. So that's our look at the life of Annie Oakley. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next week.